Welcome everyone to our June 18th Climate Work Group meeting. I'm Peter McKenna, filling in for Joanne Desmarais. She's sick today, and as your second in command, I'll call the meeting to order and start with a land acknowledgement. On June 18th, 2024, we acknowledge that this sacred land on which Smiths Falls is now located has been a site of human activity for over 10,000 years and is rich in Indigenous history. This land is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, and we are grateful to the Algonquin ancestors who cared for the land and water in order that we might meet here today. We're also grateful to the Algonquin people for their contribution in making the Rideau Canal, which runs through Smiths Falls. We're mindful of broken covenants and the need to reconcile with all our relations. Together, may we care for this land and each other, drawing on the strength of our mutual history of nation building through peace and friendship, being mindful of generations to come. Now the agenda, we doubled up on priority item 5.3 and the roundtable, so we'll do it at 5.3. Sue, if you don't mind, we don't need it twice.
That's fine.
Great. Any other changes to the agenda?
I do have the addition of two items. Sorry.
Are they roundtable items or you want agenda items?
One is a roundtable,
Okay.
the RVCA wetland consultation.
Yeah.
And
Sorry, what was that?
RVCA wetland consultation.
Thank you.
And the other is, I'm not sure where, but I'd like to talk about starting to take action. And there's two particular programs that I'd like to see us promote. So,
And you want it on today's agenda, or do you want to bring that? You can introduce it today. Is it something that's
yes.
going to carry forward, do you think?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So why don't we put it on priority issue? That would be the new 4. And you're describing that as taking action?
Yes.
All right. With Sue's name beside it. I'm looking at the screen, seeing no more. Motion to approve the agenda as amended. Made by Nate, seconded by Sue. All in favor? That's carried. Thank you. Looking at that agenda, does anyone have any conflict of interest or disclosure of monetary interest? Seeing none, we'll move right into Richard's report on the M1 Milestone 1 project update.
Okay.
Oh,
Sorry, Chair. Did we need to do the minutes? Do we need to look at
yeah,
minutes?
skipped right by them. That was a test, Marie.
Did I pass?
You passed.
Excellent.
All right, going back to item number 3, looking at the minutes of May 14th. Did anyone see any changes or errors that they wanted to make? Seeing none, a motion to approve the minutes. Nate, seconded by Sean. All in favor? That's carried. Thank you, Marie. Back to you, Richard.
All right, sliding right into the update. So here we have the corporate emissions inventory. This basically looks at the emissions as well as the energy used for the different energy sectors. This is just a total of the overall energy emissions and energy used for the different sectors. Now it says 0% for the corporate solid waste, and that's because of the method that's used when we're using the milestone tool. So it's a methane commitment model. So that's the number that they produced. I'm not entirely sure why it's 0, but that's just how it works out. Because the model does the calculations.
So with small town rural,
Yep.
we have a choice
Yes.
as to where, and so does that mean that that's not being reported in the corporate then, but it's being reported in the community?
So what this is looking at essentially is all the waste produced by the town-owned facilities, not just the town as a whole, but just the corporate facilities. Yes. So there's a distinction.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. There is an argument in favor of including the community waste in the corporate because it's the corporate that decides how the community waste is managed.
Fair enough. So for us, we have our waste picked up by GIM and it's transported out. So if it makes sense to include the whole waste for the community and the corporate side, because the corporation is one doing that kind of work, I'm open to that consideration, but that's just where how we decide to put it in the sector for the community or the corporate.
So just so I'm clear, is it allowed under the way this is structured, or is it just it's something that can be
For
discussed?
small town rural areas, yes.
It's an
Now,
option.
Yes.
In cities, it's put into the community. Even though a city may be making the decision, but in our case, we have the choice.
Nate, go ahead.
Just a point of clarification, the question on how did the corporate solid waste get to zero? The zero is under the energy,
Yes.
which is, it doesn't produce energy. It is being counted under emissions. It's not a source of energy. And in
Yes,
general, the energy, like that energy column
Yeah.
is really confusing for people and more or less irrelevant to what we're doing. We're not trying to control energy. It's part of how we calculate the emissions, but it's really confusing next to each other. And nothing we're doing is really about energy fundamentally. It's about the emissions. So
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for the clarification.
No worries.
So is there a suggestion that in future drafts that maybe a
Take it out.
footnote and that's just moved somewhere else, or?
yeah, these are generated through the Milestone toolkit, and I'm not inclined to produce any more work around it. I would just as a point of clarification, when you're looking at these things, I basically try to ignore that whole column because it's only confusing.
Sean?
I'm good now. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, so now looking.
So do
sorry,
we want to answer Sue's question now?
making the decision? Sure.
Is there any preference? In putting it in corporate, it does, it's interesting down the road how actions then in the corporate end up getting the attention of the municipality, whereas those in the community side get less attention. And because the municipality is making the decision about how the waste is managed, then leaving it or having it in the corporate end is suggestive that it does.
Keeps it front and center in the decision makers.
Yep.
All right. Nate?
I'm not familiar with a version of this that they describe where they're mixing the two for just one. But the toolkit system does have an option of you can separate these or keep them together. And my sense, in the same way that I wish they didn't have the energy thing, I wish they didn't separate them because it just creates two data sets and they're both producing numbers that people find confusing. And to the extent you can simplify, I think that it's hugely beneficial. So I would be in favor of not only doing what Sue's describing, but just writ large combining these. It's all emissions that the town is making. I don't
Fair
see
enough,
a
fair
particular benefit in distinguishing between corporate and community.
Fair enough.
How would we know if the corporation made advances or the community when they're rolled? What if without tracking them separately, but when they're rolled up for public consumption, they're
I think the thinking behind having the corporate separate is that it does create a mechanism where the local government can take credit for its efforts. And I think that's laudable and a reasonable thing. I think that's basically the only reason to do it, because in terms of just understanding the nature of the problem and whatnot, the emissions are all the same and it's all the same community doing them. In the gathering of this data, they'll be separate, and it's still, if anybody wants to point to a success on the corporate level, they easily can. The data is still there. But in terms of when we present this, are we presenting 2 or 3 footprints or 1?
Right.
Because I don't think most people can comprehend 3 footprints.
I would say that it is better to keep them separate, corporate and community, aside from the waste issue.
Fair.
And it does make it easier to manage, Peter, on a municipal level than when you are seeing your own.
that's fine. So if the committee agreed that going forward that do people understand everything? Good?
So we're putting the corporate waste and community waste in one.
Under the corporate.
Basket.
That makes sense. Okay, I can do that.
Going forward.
Is it also going to be in the community waste?
No. Also, the community waste would be slid into the corporate column.
Okay. How would that impact individual people's motivation to minimize
Their own waste?
if it's not part of the community calculation?
The challenge actually becomes, in the devil is in the details, in, actually getting the numbers for the organic waste, right? The very specific.
Mhm.
And composting and that sort of thing. And so that you're not going to find in these rolled up numbers. So that's not going to affect individuals' thinking.
Oh,
We're
I
not
see
going
what
to
you're
use
saying.
these numbers to motivate people.
But I think what you're saying is spot on, that the whole point of this system is to delineate where the different things that we do cause emissions, and to move one of them into another category might be laudable for that category, but it then removes it from the other category, which is what we're directing everyone's attention to, which is why I don't think there's other examples of what you're proposing. I think it would be confusing, and I also think that the logic behind it, where you're drawing attention to it, would logically apply to other things too. And pretty soon, like I don't know which of those we wouldn't, you know what I'm saying?
Sorry, it's just,
So this
no,
is a
it's just,
one-off.
yes, absolutely. And I would argue that in fact, Lanark County and, other lower tier, small municipalities have and are doing this. So I don't have a list of them, but it's something that is particular to small town and rural municipalities. So it's not allowed for large urban centers.
So just for clarity, then this is more of an internal graph that we're looking at here.
Yeah, these are rolled up numbers.
Yeah.
I mean, they'll get published, yes, but it's,
Do we change it from corporate solid waste then to community solid waste?
this is both corporate and,
I know, but is it appropriately named?
that particular line. Yeah, we could do
The
that.
bulk of it would be community.
Yep.
Just.
Yep.
Can we do that?
Okay.
And then let's call it that.
Sure.
Yep.
And knowing that corporate's in there.
Yep.
All right.
We'll just have a caveat if anyone's reading the graph that there's included in the corporates as well.
Yep.
Okay.
Sorry, Marie. I hope you're.
I think
getting
so.
all
That's
that.
okay.
Good.
It's being recorded. I'll go back and watch it in time.
Great.
Okay, so now we're looking at the emissions to date for the community. So for the community, we looked at stationary energy, and this largely relates to buildings, plain and simple. And this looked at buildings in the residential, institutional, commercial sector. So working with Hydro One and Enbridge, we were able to give me the aggregated data for each of the sectors, and we just put them together for the stationary data. For the transportation, we looked only at on-road transportation. We consider looking at airborne, aviation, as well as water, as well as railways. But the uses were harder to find the data for that was consistent. For example, for water, we know that Lebeau is a major user of the waterway here, but they're not the only ones. So finding that fuel data would be tantamount to like surveying the population. So it would be a moving number that would be harder to track over time. So that's why we didn't include it, because it would not be something that would be necessarily very accurate. And similarly for the railway, it would only be CP and via rail. So it would be harder to get those numbers accurately for Smith Falls. So to make it easier, we remove those considerations and just simply focus on road for transportation. And for the transportation, we were working with Calibrate, and essentially they're a third-party company that does data analysis, and they specialize in transportation data. And they essentially looked at the 6 outlets for the fuel stops, and they had the data for 2021, and that's what we got to our numbers.
And so what about Will's transfer? Sorry, I'm forgetting the name of the weed company. This is embarrassing.
Canopy.
Thank you. Canopy.
Or
About any other larger companies in town that are shipping.
so that would be, I mean, if they're shipping, they weren't able to assess, their transportation costs and their transportation usage. If we're looking at Canopy, it would be similar to industrial processes, so that would be under a separate category for assessment.
Okay,
So we were not
so-
looking at the transportation
So you're not
specifically.
excluding them.
No, but they're in a separate category. So that's still part of the review.
And to that point, because this is a scope 1 test, it wouldn't consider travel outside. Like it's
No, I
limited in that respect. But the data on business electricity consumption was from the year before they closed, and it shows electricity in our town, the business consumption twice the residential, which is way outside a spec of what you would expect, but totally in keeping with the world's largest cannabis farm. And so I would expect that number is going to drop off a cliff now that they're no longer growing
Right.
cannabis there. So yeah, I think the business electricity consumption is going to drop
Okay.
dramatically.
Okay.
And for the waste, I spoke with JIM, and apparently they do collect for all of Smith Falls. So they do have the ICNI. So they were able to aggregate the data and give us a better understanding of how much waste we're producing as a whole.
Interesting.
Yeah. The only things we haven't done yet would be the agricultural, forestry, and other land uses to completely be sure that we looked at everything, as well as industrial processes and product use.
I just want to mention that the stationary energy was collected using Smith Falls postal codes, which doesn't match the municipal boundaries. We looked into getting an aggregate list of ones that only overlapped with the municipal boundaries, but that was rather tedious and tricky to do, and most of it is in Smith Falls, apart from some areas of Montague and Rita Lakes. It is still something we could look into in the future, but we held off on that for this report.
Yeah, it's always an issue.
Yes.
That K7A is.
Yes.
Yes.
It's not, you're right, it's not significant, so.
So
Well,
here
there would
are
be hundreds of homes in the rural routes.
Yeah, especially in Montague, a large, like all of the Adironto was measured for the stationary energy here, all of Golf Club Road, you know.
So
It's quite a bit.
Yeah.
It's definitely something we could look into.
So I guess you can call it the Greater Smith Falls area, for a lack of better words.
There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't, does the milestone tool say anything about that?
About
How to
Using-
incorporate or
no,
not?
they don't actually. So we'd have to tweak it our own, essentially. Either we have the exact postal codes by going through everything individually, or we just have a caveat that says that this is sort of part of the methodology that it includes great areas in Smith Falls.
Did we compare this to our, was it last time, 2017 numbers?
So the 2017 numbers look specifically at the corporate emissions, not the community. So this is the first time I'm really assessing it. I did speak with the folks at Atlantic County because they already did that work, and they reached out to Canada Post, and so that's where they got their numbers from. Their postal codes from Canada Post.
Yeah, I was just wondering if we had 2017 community numbers that were just within our borders and 2021, 2022 numbers from the broader area. It would be hugely inflated. But I guess if we're using the same measurements all the way through, we will know the progress we're making. It's always going to be inflated.
Yeah, exactly.
And can we inquire what Lanark did with Montague and Adirondack? Because if we'd be just counting it twice, that's all. If they were able to count it, or did they say, you know what, that's a K7A postal code, we're just going to leave it. If we knew what they did, then.
I can ask them specifically what they did for Montague and then the surrounding municipalities if they made a distinction. I know that just for us, because it has Smith Falls address, they kind of went with that.
Yeah, no, I understand it. And you're right, tedious was a good word, I think. I'm sure the post office could help us sort that, but.
So I even spoke with like finance here, and because they do postal work to mail things out for, say, the water billing, and they have the same issue. It's hard to get consistent numbers, especially if things are changing.
I just wondered if the last three are only for, does Adirondack have its own last three? I don't know.
Yep.
Are we okay to start like this and keep working on getting better numbers going forward?
Yes.
How many people are in Adirondack? How many water bills do we send out? 200?
None.
No,
We just sell them bulk water.
we sell
So
it.
we're producing it.
Right.
They're all big
Yeah,
costs.
they pay for it.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's going to be in our numbers for water and wastewater.
But there wouldn't be 200 homes over there, would there?
It's like 120 or something
Yeah,
like that.
okay.
We could figure out a per capita of the rest of them,
Yeah.
times it by 120 and deduct that from the total. We just
Yeah.
wanted to get a ballpark.
But in the end, we're still using energy to provide water, wastewater.
Water and sewer, yeah.
Yeah.
And they're, by all intents, residents, they consume everything here, they
Yeah.
buy things. Anyway, all right. Are we good with that?
Yes, we are. So this is a breakdown for the numbers for the different energy sectors. So the residential, commercial, and the manufacturing industries would be under stationary, and the on-road is separate, and the water and wastewater and sewage is separate. So if you're looking at the stationary as a whole, it would be 44%, just to give you a ballpark. And that's just the buildings. The road would be 54%, which is another big one. And then the wastewater is at least at 4%.
Yeah, but one industry consuming 4%, that's, not to underestimate it, it's a big number still. I went down a rabbit hole after reading Calgary's water break and looked at per capita consumption, and it looks like Ontario, it's 350 liters per day per person, or per household, I can't remember which. And then I wondered what Smith Falls was, and it's in one of our reports. I was just curious. We are still water hogs, like nobody's business.
Right.
Not that it's related. Any more questions on the energy?
Yeah, just the disparity between the total emissions and the energy. So I assume it depends on the type of energy
Yes.
consumed.
So either
Where
it's
should it
going to
come
be
from?
natural gas or diesel or fossil fuels. So yeah.
Electricity, our grid is 90% green, so electricity is waste. In the presentation I have, it breaks it down, but that's the disparity right there. It's just the energy grid.
So our manufacturers are using natural gas. A lot of bigger source natural gas.
Yeah, it's one of the big ones, for sure.
That's the value, in fact, of having the energy breakdown
Mm.
by source, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So yeah, this is just to date. The only things left are just to be assessed the other industrial uses here, just to ensure that they're not necessarily captured in stationary energy. And then once we are confident that that's been reviewed properly, and the same thing goes for the agricultural, forestry, and other land uses. So that relates to like considerations for the forest tree canopy that we have here, or the wetlands, if we wanted to properly include it in our overall assessment. Yeah, we're pretty close.
Steve, you're okay? Any questions, comments? You're good? Okay.
So I'm sorry, Richard, can I still get the breakdown?
Yes.
That translated to this.
Okay, I don't have the graph on me.
There's 3 shades of blue that are very similar.
So if you're colorblind, you're in trouble.
I'm not even colorblind. Even I'm trying to figure it out. And I
Can't figure
remember
out
the
which is
thing.
which here, so.
Buy a new printer.
What I'll do is-
Still gets clunky.
What I'll do is after this, I'll send you a better graph because it's harder for me to piece it together right now.
No, that would be hugely helpful.
Yeah.
Because I do find, actually, in all the stuff that I do, it's these graphs that I keep referring back to.
Okay. Yeah.
So, yeah, they're very useful.
I'll send a follow up to the committee so that they have the better graphs to review. Okay. So that concludes my presentation for now.
Any comments on the M1 project update?
I just want to compliment Richard on all the work that he's done.
Oh,
on this.
thanks.
I don't know if the other people, it's math you kind of do alone and no one sees what you've done, but he invited me to come to his office and let me talk his ear off for hours about this. He's been chasing these things down a rabbit hole, and like this system demands a lot of municipal staff in a way that I totally did not appreciate, and the whole staff, but particularly led by him, has been really impressive in this regard. And I wanted to make sure everybody was clear on that. It's a really impressive work product that they've been generating. So great work. Keep it up. Thank you.
And if I could add, I would ditto that. I mean, having been there, done this. In the portal, where you put the methodology for your calculations be super detailed.
Mhm.
Because 5 years from now, when this is updated, whoever's doing it will need to see that detail.
Right.
I've just spent hours back in Tay Valley Township
Working through.
explaining to them what I did in
Mhm.
those calculations. And I did detailed notes. So it's super helpful. So just make a point of doing that, because otherwise they'll be swearing at you 5 years from now.
I guess I have to add my notes to the general notes, but yeah, you're right. Okay, thanks for that.
That's great. And make sure that, Maria, not make sure, would you please acknowledge Nate's comments, Richard? And Nate, thanks for going in and giving up an afternoon. I bet you brought a bouquet of flowers with you.
Oh yeah,
Oh, stop.
it was a scene.
All right, so
Okay, Nate, over to you. Milestone 1, Scope 3.
Okay. This is quite the rabbit hole we're going to dive down. Okay, so
you can run through your presentation,
Do
or
you
you
have a copy of this one? You should have.
yeah, I mean it's on the slide deck, right?
yes,
So,
on slide deck.
yeah. So if it's all right with you, I'll just ask you to switch slides as we go.
Okay,
But
sure.
I guess if we could just go to the first slide, I'm going to ramble on for a little while and then we'll get started. But just some level setting so we're all clear what we're talking about here. What I've compiled is what's considered a scope 3. So it's the same project that Richard's been working on, but Richard's been working on a scope 1, and I've been working on a scope 3. And the distinction there is whether it's basically small, medium, and large, where municipalities, and the same system applies to companies, where they're invited to choose whether they want to acknowledge some of their carbon footprint, more of their carbon footprint, or all of their carbon footprint. And I just think that fundamentally that is a unhelpful system, and it all but guarantees a radical undercounting of your footprint. And I'm sorry, let me back up for a second. I circulated a link to a video called Rethink Methane, and I encourage everyone to see it. But in that video, one of the leading climate scientists describes the latest thinking around methane, and it's really there's a whole new movement around methane because there's a key difference between methane and CO2, and CO2 just accumulates in the atmosphere, whereas methane is on an 11-year cycle. And so with methane, we don't need to shrink our methane footprint, we just need to keep it stable. And if we do shrink our methane footprint, it pulls CO2 out of the atmosphere. So it's an enormously exciting approach to fighting climate change. It's some of the only good news on the subject. And it's changing a lot of the way climate scientists approach this. The SpaceX just launched a methane satellite. Almost all the major climate change organizations are talking about they're calling it a methane moment. There's a recurring saying that I really like that says we have to run the methane sprint in order to win the CO2 marathon. And I think that's a helpful way of thinking about these things. But one of the key there's two key takeaways by that insight that methane is fundamentally different. So the current system that all the signatory countries are using to calculate their carbon footprint takes methane and times the weight by 25 to get a CO2 equivalent. And it does that with the different greenhouse gases. And that's just fundamentally wrong. It just doesn't, they aren't directly comparable in that way at all. And so the first main change that this rethinking methane leads to is not using CO2 equivalents wherever possible. And so in this model, I start with CO2 equivalents, but then break them down the road, and I'll explain how I do that. But that's the first thing. But the second thing is, if the new strategy around methane is about limiting net methane, it simply will not do to only count some of our footprint. Like the only way that strategy works is if everybody counts their complete footprint, because the atmosphere doesn't care where these gases are sourced, and natural sources of methane are identical to the anthropogenic sources, and it's the same with the other chemicals. So that's my way of saying that I want to quite emphatically suggest that we should do a scope 3, not a scope 1. And want to be really clear that I'm in no way disparaging all the amazing work that Richard and the rest of the staff has done. And what they've done here is quite impressive, but I don't think we should use it. I think we should literally stop working on it and switch gears to a scope 3. And I want to try to defend that argument. I know that may sound a little bit radical, but I want to try to defend that in this presentation. The other,
Can I just check?
go ahead.
Is there a scope 3 or is this something that you're,
I've done, it's completed here.
no, but is there such a thing as a scope 3?
Oh yes,
All
it's-
right,
and
okay.
Toronto did it.
Okay,
Like it's basically the like
So we're
gold.
really not going that radical.
Oh, not at all. No,
All
it's
right,
it's basically the
More
gold
detail,
standard.
yeah.
Yeah, very much so. So the other key distinction between these two approaches is the approach that Richard has been going with is based on direct reporting, where he goes and chases down these individual numbers and then puts it into a toolkit. Whereas what I'm doing is based on statistical extrapolations. And I'll dive more into exactly how that looks. But going into this, my background is in monitoring greenhouse gases around for carbon farming. So I'm used to doing this from that perspective, and I like pulling from accurate numbers. Like I would much rather get some data from a machine than I would do a statistical analysis. So naturally, I'm predisposed to the approach that is in the scope 1 that is described in the toolkit. Seeing it in practice, I no longer see it as a more accurate method. And what I've really learned watching both of these things unfold simultaneously is neither one of them is a pure pulling straight numbers out. They both incorporate an actual reading with a statistical analysis. And let me give you a classic example. In the scope 1 that was just reported on, we used the purchase sales data around gasoline. So they went to the 5 gas stations or however many there were, figured out how much gas they sold. And so that's the accurate number. And the statistical component is there's an average of how much greenhouse gas emissions that's based on. Now, in some of them, those were high efficient vehicles. Some of them, they were low efficient vehicles. Some of them were going to have worse outputs than others. It wasn't actually a pure straight number of sales. It's a combination of an actual number with a statistic. And as I go through my presentation, you'll see that that's true of almost everything with both approaches. So they both utilize both systems, and that was interesting to me. The other thing is that those straight numbers that I kind of assumed would always be more accurate than statistical numbers just aren't. Like, for instance, with this gas sales, because we're a major conduit, that's including the sales of everyone driving through. And I ran the numbers based on that reporting. And if those numbers are accurate, the average household in Smiths Falls is spending more than $700 a month on gas, which just can't be true. And for every household that doesn't have a car, there's a household spending $1,400 a month. So our footprint is eating all of these people passing through. And those types of errors are probably true with a lot of things. And so it's not accurate to think that a direct measurement approach is any better. And I'll give you another example. The toolkit was producing some really questionable data for a while, and we were trying to chase down what that was. And again, like the towns, I think a lot of town would have just given up, and this team actually chased down the geek rabbit hole and figured out the things, and we used an AI system to check everything. And at one point, the toolkit was generating data that was 10 times the average. And because I was looking at national averages and I was comparing what Perth did and everything, I could look at it and see that total number was literally tenfold too high. And I flagged it, and they figured it out, and now it's much more accurate. It's basically in line with Perth. But that discovery of that error was because we were doing a statistical analysis. So the statistical analysis can actually be a way of getting a much more accurate number and flag, where there's a major outlier. So I just wanted to cover that. Could we go to the next slide? So, because what I'm doing here does break some new ground, and some of it's more controversial than others, and this is all tends to be a controversial subject, what I'm trying to do in this presentation is just be intellectually accurate and just be honest about where I see the right number and where I've made a judgment call and what is controversial and what's not. So I'm going to try to just describe the thinking behind how I got to each of these numbers so that it can make sense. A lot of them, there's, reasonable people could disagree and come to different conclusions, and I'm going to try to spell out where that range would be. Now, at the end of my presentation, I briefly describe a path to net zero. And really, that's not the first milestone. That's like the second and third milestone. But a reality when talking about should we do a scope 1 versus a scope 3 is that it's just human nature to not want to acknowledge a problem unless you can see some kind of solution. And it's just totally normal for a municipality to prefer a much smaller carbon footprint to a larger one. And so I thought it was important to at least show that it's mathematically possible to get to net zero. I'm not trying to make it sound like it's going to be easy, because it won't, but I wanted to end the presentation with a note of hope. So that's what's happening there. So, okay, now let's dive down the geek rabbit hole. We're gonna start with Toronto. So Canada writ large has done a very good job of getting the memo that we need to focus on methane. They've released methane ambitions that are more ambitious than what they're trying to do with CO2. And they're spending a lot of money on R&D. There's a competition happening called the Methane Challenge, where it's like a giant science fair for grown-ups with $1 million prizes to try to figure out any way to shrink our methane footprint. And one of the best examples of anywhere in Canada of someone leaning into this is the municipality of Toronto. And they're the biggest municipality, so they, these things, it would cost the same for us to do this as it would of Toronto to do it, but because they have 3 million people per capita, it's much cheaper for a municipality like them to do a proper calculation, and then we can just steal their numbers. So what they did was brilliant by mathematical standards, I would say. And what they did an analysis of emissions based on spending. And I'd never thought of that as an approach before, but everything you do costs money. And if they can calculate what the different activities that you might spend money on, what their footprint is, and then they look at the spending data of their citizenry, they can quantify how much of each activity they're doing. And there's different very sophisticated systems that check this data and score it and try to figure out which models are working and which aren't. And this model is enormously celebrated. It's quite an impressive, robust approach to quantifying a carbon footprint. And when they did that, when they calculated their total scope 3, what they found, the number that they generated was 2.5 times the number that they had generated shortly before just doing the regular emission sectors. So already, I think that's a very compelling argument that they were radically undercounting it before. Most municipalities regularly undercount it by design, and that their system is much better. Now, pulling the data from Toronto to Smiths Falls is admittedly imperfect. I'm not suggesting that the carbon footprint of a family in Smiths Falls is exactly that of Toronto. But as a starting point, we share an electrical grid, we share an energy grid in general, we share a food supply, it's similar culture, similar eating habits. Under most areas, you would not expect there to be too dramatic a difference. The one exception is in transportation, because Toronto has a subway system, the TTC, and Smiths Falls doesn't. You could expect there to be a fairly decent discrepancy there. But I was looking at the census data, and the people in Smiths Falls actually have a shorter commute than people in Toronto. So yes, more people are driving by car in Smiths Falls, but those two probably can somewhat cancel each other out on a per capita basis. Can I get you to move to the next slide?
Yeah, I did.
Lovely. Okay. So if you just take what Toronto did in terms of their analysis of every activity that they do on a per household basis, and then times that by the number of households in Smiths Falls, you get the graph that you're looking at now. And I found it quite eye-opening. It does a very detailed analysis of all of the different ways that our activities create greenhouse gases. And it just paints a different picture than a scope 1 analysis. And that's really the part that I want to emphasize here. And the part of where this all gets very controversial is what we choose to focus on is inherently political. And a lot of the criticisms around climate change are kind of disingenuous and unfair, but the one that I think is quite valid is that the climate change movement and the environmentalists have not been particularly data-driven, and we've been much more reluctant to pick on our friends than our enemies. So it's like my generation, this tends to be a generational thing, not trying to be ageist, but my generation and older grew up in an environmental movement that was basically just focused on the energy sector and protecting forests and wetlands. And really not focused on agriculture, really not focused on methane. It was just an earlier, simpler time. The modern focus, if you look at this math, look at where electricity is on this grid. It's literally smaller than alcohol. You can't look at this chart and say that we should be focusing on electricity right now. The healthcare is huge. We almost never hear about that, but it's an enormous aspect of this. And so this is controversial, but I think if you don't focus on who you're pleasing and who you're upsetting, if you just try to accurately count the number, this is a very accurate place to start. Now, when I'm trying to make the case here that we should be using this approach as opposed to the toolkit, the strongest argument against that is that a scope 3 is too arduous and it's too challenging and it's just a way heavier lift than a scope 1. And I just want to push back on that as hard as I can, because this work product that I did took me about a week with the help of some AI programs, but maybe less than that. What we've been doing, the town, it was more than 2 years now? We're still not done. And it takes an enormous amount of resources. Whereas what I've done is a simple program that could auto-populate the toolkit. Like literally, it would be trivial for that toolkit to, when somebody signs up for this program, the way this municipality did a couple of years ago, to just day one have the numbers that I'm presenting here. It could just be, because they're based on averages, and you could use national data, or if you wanted to be more accurate, you could go province by province. But I think that would be a much more defensible way of approaching all of this. So, okay, the base that I'm starting from is based on the Toronto footprint. And the rest of this presentation, slide by slide, I add things onto that I think makes sense. And I do that incrementally so you can see how that changes the carbon footprint. And because some of these are more controversial than others, you may support doing some of them but not others. So I wanted to be able to parse that out. So, okay.
So catch your breath for 1 second. We'll just check to see if there's any questions.
Questions? Sorry, I know I'm speed talking math here.
So, I'm following you, which is good, right? For me, especially. The only consideration, and you had lots of caveats why it's imperfect, and you really said, no, this isn't perfect. Do you think that in many ways, you're right, we have the same electricity, the same healthcare. What are our demographics? We have a very low income community, and Toronto is a much younger overall city. Mm-hmm. And what does the data show us on consumption of wealthier people versus poor people or low income?
It's a great question. And it almost sounds crass to say that the issues we have around low income are an advantage in this game, but it's like wealth is not the solution here. Like the wealthier people have much larger footprints on a per capita basis.
But is it enough to skew this by any more than a few percent?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I'll tell you, I did a whole lot of troubleshooting there, and one of the things I did was look at average income and try to see if I could make a distinction that would be meaningful. Yeah. And I couldn't really find a defensible approach, but it's within a few points, I would say.
Good. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Oh, I just want to ask why you picked Toronto. Did they just have a really good set of data to draw from?
Yeah, I think in general, I think the North Star for a statistical extrapolation approach is you find the closest, best data. and Toronto, we share enough things, like the big things, especially. Like if you look on here, the energy grid, the food supply, healthcare, almost all of those, I would think they would be almost exact. And I cross-referenced this data with the Smiths Falls data that you guys were able to gather. And for example, electricity is exactly the same for both, which is what you would expect. So there's reason to think that both are getting to similar places on that, which is encouraging.
I don't really have a question. Just be mindful of time.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Toronto has a much greater intensification of buildings, much more greater presence of commercial and industrial development, in contrast to Smiths Falls, of course. So how does that potentially impact the numbers?
It's a great question. So what they've done here in expansion, they've separated that out from the corporate one, which I'm going to get to next. And in building and development, it's based on a growth rate. So we could do an analysis where, like, each of these numbers, I think it would be a worthwhile thing, or anywhere where we see a potential for a discrepancy, to spend our time trying to correct those and say, like, okay, if Toronto has a growth rate of 6% and we have a growth rate of 1%, then let's take the new building construction that we're seeing in Toronto and, claim 30% of it or 20% of it. You know what I'm saying? Like, you can make those adjustments. What I would say is, writ large, just by pulling their numbers directly, we're getting a number that's much closer to accurate than our best guess using this system, which is definitely just ignoring most of this. So it's closer. It's definitely not perfect, but it's much closer.
Because even construction style, the use of concrete in Toronto compared to here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say that when you break it down to a per capita basis, often those have a counterpoint. So per unit, you're going to see a much higher construction footprint with these cement things, but it produces a tall building that's actually more efficient. And so they're, according to if you do a comparison between Smiths Falls and Toronto for gas, for instance, because we got a hard number for there, the natural gas usage was about 50% higher in Smiths Falls. And I don't know how much of that can be accounted for the postal code discrepancy, because that is going to affect our per capita understanding of it. But some of that may very well be that our houses are just bigger
And old stock.
And so that would be an example of, maybe we make an argument that our natural gas thing should be slightly higher based on that data point. And I think it would be lovely to try to improve on these numbers with meaningful data. But as a starting point, rather than starting with a blank page, we should start with our best guess. And I think this is our best guess.
Okay.
I'm mindful of time. Should we? Yeah. Can I get you to move to the next slide? Okay. So Toronto's corporate CVI, I think, is probably quite different than Smiths Falls. That one, I think, much less comparable. And it's much easier to get that number here. So I would be inclined to use the Smiths Falls numbers for that. Mm-hmm. Now, in this presentation, I took what they calculated as 6% of their community usage and did the math. Sorry, could I get you to go to the next slide? Did the math on if it was 6% of ours. So if the ratios were about the same, what would it look like? Oh, you know what? It's kind of cut off on this one. Can you see it?
Yeah.
The one on the far, it's the one on the far right. There we go. Yeah. So that gives you a sense of if our corporate CVEI is the same as Toronto's as a ratio, it would be there, which would put it about on par with furnishings and appliances. So relatively small in the grand scheme of things, but is what it is. Does that make sense? Is everybody clear on what I've gotten so far? Mm-hmm. Okay. So in the same way that we're just kind of adding one thing, the next thing we're going to talk about is wetlands. Can I get you to move to the next slide? So Smiths Falls has a quite substantial wetland, and wetlands, it's kind of a darling of the environmental industry. I'm from the Reader Roundtable. I'm a big fan of wetlands, And because of that, it can be very hard for environmentalists to hear that there's any issues around wetlands or reason why we might want to intervene with wetlands. But the reality is that wetlands emit methane. And with climate change, that's heating up and more methane is being emitted from them writ large. And so our strategy that was described in that Rethink Methane video of trying to prevent the total net methane from growing, one of the biggest concerns there is, what if all the wetlands across Canada start emitting more methane each year because it's warming up? We need to offset that through improved cattle, through improved other things. So monitoring methane emissions from wetlands is really, really important, and particularly human engineered wetlands. And one of the interesting things I didn't know until I started working on this is human engineered wetlands actually produce much more methane typically than naturally occurring wetlands. And when I went to do the modeling of this system, and I calculated the number of square meters, and I looked at the range of methane emissions based on human engineered wetlands, they were so enormous, I was like, this can't be right, and I didn't go with that. And I think the reason is that most of the human engineered wetlands that they're describing are part of sewage treatment systems, and that's not what we have here. So even though this is a human engineered wetland, when I did the modeling, I decided it's more like a mature beaver pond. And I think that's accurate because it's 200 years old. It has some water flowing through it. There isn't data around lock systems, but there's a ton of data around beaver ponds. So I did the math on what this would be if it was a beaver pond, which is significantly less than a human-made wetland. And again, reasonable people could go with either one of those. Now, with beaver ponds, the amount of methane that are produced by them is determined by the temperature. So because global temperatures are going up, they're producing more methane, and also the depth of the water. And the deeper the water is, the more the methane interfaces with the water, the less methane gets produced. So shallow bodies of water like ours are on the high end of the spectrum. So wherever possible in this model, I cite a peer-reviewed journal. And so I took a peer-reviewed journal article that modeled a bunch of different beaver ponds and used direct measurements. And then I took the higher end of that range, which is 5 grams per square meter. And could I get you to go to the next slide?
Yeah.
And so that's what the 90 acres of wetlands looks like on our thing. So again, it's bigger than electricity. It's definitely worth counting. And I think that may very well be like a low end guess. And usually I try to not do a low end guess, but as I described, we're calling it a beaver pond. Okay.
Which slide is that one?
This one right here, the one with 90 acres of wetland is on the far right. Oh, I'm sorry, one line over. There you go.
Oh, yeah, okay, thanks.
So in each of these progressive slides, I add one column to the far right and leave everything the same. You'll notice the others adjust as a function of ratio, but so if we wanted to do this is like everything up till here, this would be our total. And in the upper left-hand corner, you can see what that total is. So we're currently up to 158,511 tons of CO2 equivalent.
Right.
Does that make sense? Everybody
Yeah,
good?
no, I'm following you.
Okay. Can I get you to move to the next slide? Please and thank you.
I'm gonna adjust it.
Yeah, do you mind just pulling that out a little bit? Wonderful. Okay. So federal services. I'm stunned that you don't see this in more of the models. Like for all the same reason why you would count your healthcare, you also need to count like federal prisons. You need to count your military. Like all of those are things that on a per capita basis we use, and it just seems intellectually dishonest not to count it. It also seems unpatriotic. Like we're supposed to thank our armed forces for their service, but we're not counting their service. I can't understand why that isn't just a standard issue here, but I added it to this. And the thing that I want to really focus everyone's attention on is the upper right-hand corner here. You see that there's a 0.025%, and it's a pie chart, but you can barely see the pie slice that we're talking about, because what I've done is I've taken Canada has 40 million people in it, and Smiths Falls' share of that is tiny. It's literally 25,000%. And so when I say I want us to claim our share of this in this, I'm not saying I want to claim all of it. I'm saying I want to claim our fair share of it. And I think that's basically just a token in this example, but it's controversial, and it's important when you consider, for instance, in the States, they're going through a very similar exercise, but they typically don't count their military in their footprint, and their footprint, it's enormous. And if you fail to count it, you've completely failed to achieve net zero. So as a precedent, I think it's really important, even though in this particular example, if I could get you to go to the next slide, it's completely trivial. Like the portion of our thing that's federal services is next to nothing. Now, if we were in the States, it would be a huge number because they have such an enormous military, but we don't, so it's small. But I think
You're making a statement.
yeah, and I think it's an important one to, like, ethically and morally, in terms of just trying to be intellectually honest about the circumstances we find ourselves.
The federal government must count it in their plans.
They do, and that's where we're getting these numbers, and they're making their own efforts to shrink it. And I talk about that in the later portion of this. But yes, they absolutely do. Okay, great. We're on the forest fires one. Can I get you to pull out on this one, or does it work like that? Can you see the whole slide?
Trying to, so.
Yeah. Okay. No worries. So this one's probably the most controversial of all the slides on the deck. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time explaining how I went about getting this number. So last year was an exceptionally bad forest fire year. I think everybody's clear on that. And I made an effort to calculate where, on a per capita basis, the effects of the forest fire, how much of our carbon footprint that would take in. Now, I'm going to dive into the politics around it, but first I just want to dive into the math around this. So reasonable people can definitely disagree on how best to do what I did. And I want to just describe the judgment calls that I made. So when you're dealing with an outlier number, like a particularly bad forest fire year, one approach is to cancel out that number. If it's an outlier, go with the average of the other numbers. And I think generally speaking, in most types of statistical analysis, that's the best practice. With climate change, we've done that for a long time. And what we've noticed is every year there's an outlier number and it keeps getting worse and worse. And so if you just cancel out the most recent one, you're always going to systematically undercount. And so a more accurate approach is a trend line, where you look at trajectory. And by that, if you're looking at smaller, that's growing bigger, the footprint that you would cast for this would be larger than last year's crazy year. So you could argue that the number should be bigger than last year reasonably, and you could argue that the number should be smaller than last year reasonably. What I did was I took a peer-reviewed journal article that did a good job of calculating the greenhouse gases emitted by August. So it's not even a complete measurement of that year. And I'm using that number as a placeholder, not just for forest fires, but not just for this forest fire, but all forest fires and melting permafrost and the escalating methane from the wetland. So basically all of the natural sources, or semi-natural because climate change is inducing them, all of those sources of greenhouse gases, I've put into one category, and the number I'm putting on it is based on a peer-reviewed journal article that at least we can defend. And I think that's a good place. There's no perfect way to do this, but I think that's a reasonable number to land on there that's defensible. And then again, I want to emphasize upper right-hand corner there. I am not suggesting we're owning all of it. I'm saying 25,000th of a percentage of this problem Smiths Falls should take ownership of. Could I get you to move to the next slide?
Sure.
Sorry, can you scroll over to the right a bit?
Yeah.
So when you do that, this is what happens to our footprint. And that's why I think it's so important that we do this, because in Canada, like what I was describing with America, with the military, in Canada, that's our natural sources of greenhouse gases. And it is so important that we get a handle on the melting permafrost and the forest fires. More so, like just on a mathematical basis, it's more important than all of the other issues combined. And when we fail to count it, when we do these types of programs and we assess our carbon footprint, we're essentially doing a cover-up. And I think it's really important that every municipality, starting with ours, when we're showing our carbon footprint, we show the whole thing. And so, sorry, can I get you to go to the next slide?
Sure.
So that slide breaks down the footprint of every one that I just showed you with a thing added each time. So again, I like if one of these people are comfortable with or not comfortable with, we could choose to keep or limit any of them. But before we dive into that, I want to spend just a little bit of time looking forward. Do you guys have any questions so far before we talk and describe what we can do about this footprint for a minute?
More of an observation. As soon as you added the forest fires, obviously all the other numbers have got adjusted and
Holy, right? Yeah. And I think that's an important, like, eye-opening thing that's way underappreciated. And when you look at this final graph here, and then you look at like the scope 1 that we just looked at from Richard, that scope 1 is describing a completely different problem. And it happens to be a problem that really shines a spotlight on the groups that environmentalists tend to not like and completely ignores the thorny issues of what do we do to intervene in our forests to make them a net sink instead of a net producer. What do we do about the fact that all wetlands are producing more methane? Like, these are enormously critical questions that we can't cover up in our modeling.
right.
So-
So the reality is, even if we took our emissions from natural gas and gasoline down to zero,
wouldn't even make a dent. I shouldn't say that.
Well,
it would make
yeah.
a slight dent,
Yeah.
but not near
Right.
like. And we shouldn't hide that fact. And if you bear with me for a minute, I have some proposals on how we could
You
adjust
had a
it.
but, I think.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
well, no, I guess that's the reality of how do we, these are issues that are so much beyond.
But on the other hand, there's thousands of communities, and if they all got their natural gas down, it does add up. It's not, if you just look at Smiths Falls, you're right.
Well, let me
But
break this
it's never
down.
the intent that we would be alone. It would be the whole country.
Agreed.
Right.
So I'm sorry.
I
Can
know
get
that
you to go to
you're
that?
right.
No, I
I
appreciate it. I don't mean to cut you off. I'm about to address what we're talking about in the next slide. I'm all excited and caffeinated. So
Yeah.
can I get you to? Yeah. Okay. So what I did here was I took the total number of households in Smiths Falls. I took the growth rate from the two previous censuses, and I extrapolated based on that growth rate, what is our footprint going to look like down the road? And you see I go up in like 5-year increments to 2044. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the one thing I guess on our growth rate in the last two censuses were decline, very, very, I think maybe a decline or a very modest increase, and then a reasonable increase.
Yes.
And we, based on our official plan, which was based on data collected in 2013, issued and put together in 14, and now under a review, because the growth targets we had in the 20-year growth targets we had in 2014, we have already significantly exceeded 10 years later.
Nice.
So the growth going forward, we can't determine what that will be going forward.
Yeah.
But we know that where we are today, I suspect based on the fact there were 700 new residential units built over last 4 years, we probably have some in the neighborhood of 1,000 plus new residents over and above what was there.
Okay.
So the numbers are going to be
I love
different than what we see here. Based on
I love
census.
it. Yeah. And so that's the type of insight that I think would be like, let's amend this with that. And if we can take the rate of growth that we saw in the last one and compare that to the number of new units coming on. And if there's a discrepancy of X number, we add that to the growth rate here, and we can have that, just anticipate that continuing through the whole stretch. And again, these numbers are blurry enough just looking now. When you try to extrapolate forward, it gets almost silly. But if you'll bear with me, the reason why I think it's important to look forward 20 years is because of the mathematical process that I'm about to describe. Can I get you to go to that next slide? So what I do here is try to break down a path to zero focused on food security. And I'm not trying to dictate that we have to just focus on food security. Far from it. I leave a space here to do everything else. What I just want to show is that it is at least mathematically possible to get to zero starting from the numbers that we're at. And I just want to show what that would look like. And I also talk about the moving from a CO2 equivalent to actual greenhouse gases. Could I get you to just jump to the next slide? And don't feel you need to read all of these things. I'm just using them as speaker notes. You can refer to it later. But so, okay, what we're starting with here is that big yellow circle is Smiths Falls greenhouse gas footprint in 20 years. We're putting it at just under 620,000. So quite a big footprint. Now, if we focus on food security, now that doesn't mean we're not doing a bunch of other things, but if our primary path to actually getting to zero is around creating a low greenhouse gas food hub and make this the broader region, not just Smiths Falls, but our neighboring municipalities, try to get this whole region to really lean in on low greenhouse gas farming and creating a food supply that doesn't produce a ton of greenhouse gases. If we were to do that, this is how I see it. This is the model that I see playing out. So the first part, first and foremost, is about staying in our lane. And just as I think it's extremely important that we acknowledge the issues with the forest fires, we also want to be crystal clear that we don't have the capacity to fix that, and that the province and the federal government need to find safe interventions. And I don't think it's appropriate for us at this point to dictate what those safe interventions could be, but there's a lot. Forests naturally sequester enormous amounts of carbon. There's a big problem with bark beetles. There's a big problem with melting permafrost, but there really are solutions to those problems, and we need to demand that our government at a higher level address those problems. And every year that we go through this and reevaluate this plan, a key part of that plan, and it's true of all municipalities, is if we want to get to net zero, it depends on the federal government keeping up their end of that bargain. So the blue here is that. It's restoring natural sinks. I'm sorry, could I just get you so people can see it in the thing? Yeah. So and you'll notice in the progression, in the same way I kept building on in the carbon footprint in each slide, now you're going to see it go down in each slide as I eliminate something. So just pulling away those things.
In our lane.
Yeah, that's staying in our lane. Okay, so now we're at staying in our lane, raising awareness about the need for federal and provincial government to deploy a greenhouse gas-free energy grid. That's the idea that in the next 20 years, they need to close that 10% of our electricity that comes from fossil fuels, and they need to eliminate natural gas or use biofuels so that it's carbon neutral. Now, again, if you can barely even see the sliver of this that would be greenhouse gas-free electricity. It's that tiny little blue thing, but that's because our grid's already 90%. But the natural gas is quite significant there, and it does take a significant chunk. And again, we're not hiding that it's an issue. We're also not pretending that we have the capacity to address it. We're raising awareness that the responsible parties need to address it. Could I get you to go to the next slide, please?
Yep.
Okay, the next one's electric vehicles. And I think we talked about this in the last meeting. I have no idea what percentage of Smiths Falls residents in 20 years are going to be driving electric vehicles. In this, I put the number at 50%. It could be more, it could be less. But again, we don't have any control over that. It'd be nice to encourage people to buy electric vehicles, but it's usually a price issue. So just like all the other issues, we're trying to raise awareness on a federal and provincial level that they need to develop trade and manufacturing practices that will facilitate better adoption of these vehicles. But I put the number at 50%. I'm open to moving that if there's any better numbers out there. Okay, so this is where we really dive down the geek rabbit hole. Can I get you to move to the next slide? So now the rationalizing to moving away from greenhouse gas equivalents. So methane is fundamentally different from CO2 in that it doesn't accumulate in the atmosphere. It only lives for 11 years, 9 to 13 years. And because of that, there's that whole system where you just take every ton of methane and treat it as 25 tons of CO2 is just ridiculous and needs to stop. If we assume, and again, this is a big assumption, but if we do embrace a low greenhouse gas food system and we successfully create a hub around here, where the goal is not to eliminate methane. Again, we don't have to do that. We just have to not eat more cheeseburgers and drink more beer than we were the year before. And any intervention that you do to bring it down at all is a net gain for CO2. So like for instance, there's seaweed you can feed to cows that reduces methane by 80%. There's a ton of different things that you can do that radically reduce the amount of methane coming out of agricultural systems. And all of that can shrink our carbon footprint. So at the very least, in this model, I assume if we deploy a low greenhouse gas farming system, we don't have to count the methane, not because we're going to eliminate it, but because we can at least expect it to stay static. Now, nitrous oxide is another greenhouse gas. That one, they times it by over 100 to get it to CO2, even though it actually has less global warming potential than methane. It's just nitrous oxide lives for 114 years, and the system of CO2 equivalents normalizes everything to a 100-year timescale. So they reduce the heating of methane and increase the heating of nitrous oxide. I know I'm way down the geek rabbit hole, but bottom line, nitrous oxide is actually one of the easier ones to mitigate if you're doing sustainable agricultural practices. There's just adding biochar and certain bacteria to soils will convert soil into a net intake of nitrous oxide. So in this model, we're presuming that we don't need to concern ourselves with nitrous oxide or methane beyond what we're doing in agriculture. Okay, next slide, please.
We're nearing the end, by the way.
What's that?
Just reminding them we're nearing the end.
Oh, okay, yeah, it's nearly done. Last slide. Okay, so this slide is now that we've got our carbon footprint, and the new number we're at here, I'll have you guys notice is about 45,000. So it's come down quite a bit. But that's in CO2, and CO2 is a gas that includes the oxygen molecule. And when you convert it to biochar or any kind of actual hard carbon, there's a mathematical equation where it comes down dramatically. So 44,000 tons of CO2 converts to 12,260 tons of carbon. And just for fun as a visualizer, I did the math on what that would look like as a pile of biochar. And picture a pile of biochar 50 meters tall, like a sledding hill. That's how much carbon we're emitting under this way of understanding. Now, I'm sorry, I skipped one point. Can I just get you to back up one slide? On the rationalizing greenhouse gases, I forgot to touch on CO2. CO2 under the regular system is just counted as straight. Everything else is normalized to CO2. But in reality, 50% of CO2 comes down after 30 years. Another 30% comes down after 300 years. And it's only 20% that stays in the atmosphere for over 1,000 years. So the regular CO2 equivalent system normalizes everything to 100 years. What I do in this model to get us down to zero is I bring it to a 30-year time scale, which means we cut our CO2 goal in half. Now, some people will argue that that's not good and that we should, in fact, be calling this number twice the size that it is. I feel that if we're being super honest about when we're adding everything and taking responsibility for the things we should, we have the credibility to say, like, when we're setting goals for being carbon neutral, we shouldn't set it. We should call it at 30 years, which literally moves that finish line halfway closer to us. So it makes it a lot more feasible that we can actually accomplish these goals. Okay, could I get you to move forward to 2 slides? So in milestone 2, we're supposed to go around to the community and get their feedback on what they want to do. And I included that here, and that's important. And so, but in terms of trying to take little pieces off of the big number, we can use all the different input, whether we're creating compost bins, whether we're setting up a transit system, and all of those can chip away at that 45,000 number, which is a much more reasonable, achievable goal that people can get excited about actually chipping away from. Whereas the big number can feel daunting and impossible. Whereas this is actually something we can work on there. Can I get you to move to the next slide? So with all of these systems, with any kind of attempt to try to get to net zero, inevitably your attempts at efficiencies and cutting things out will get you part of the way there, but there's always going to be a footprint left over. You're not going to get to zero that way. And so generally speaking, in almost any climate model where they're achieving net zero, That last finish line is done through carbon farming. It's planting trees and doing other things to pull CO2. They call it offsets, but it's how you get to the finish line. And the reason why I think it's important to do a system that looks forward 20 years is so, I'm sorry, can I get you? Yeah, this last slide. If you look forward 20 years, you can figure out what our footprint's going to be there and then make a manageable plan to chip away at it over 20 years. And so what I've done here is I've modeled how much getting one farm on board will do. And I use a really good study that was done locally looking at hybrid poplars for carbon farming. And they figure that for a 100-acre farm, you get about 80 tons of carbon per year. So every farm that we can sign on to using our system and we buy food from them and have a farmer's market or whatever we're doing to encourage them, every farm we add on takes 80 tons a year out of our carbon footprint. And so I look at this and just over 20 years, I give us like 4 or 5 years to set up a system. And then, at first we have to sign 4 farms on, and then 5, and then 6. And gradually over 20 years, we get to a point where we're carbon neutral just from getting farms to do these things. So I'm not trying to say that this is going to be easy. What I'm trying to say is there is a path to carbon neutral where we're intellectually honest about our footprint and we stay in our lane and we map out achievable goals that shouldn't cost us anything. Like, we're already spending money on food. I'm not proposing tax dollars be spent on these programs. I'm proposing we direct our spending in a way that makes sense, which is also in line with what Toronto did. Toronto, when they did that initial thing that we described, that was part of their Cool Foods pledge. And they look at, for instance, one of the biggest public purchasers of food products is the school system. And so they committed that all of the food that they purchase as part of the school system is going to be from sustainably grown products. And we could do stuff like that. In fact, we could involve the school system with a lot of green farming initiatives. And those types of things I just think are infinitely more effective than the approaches where we're trying to limit our carbon footprint. Those are good too, but to the extent that we can capture carbon, that's really where we're going to see these big returns. So with that, I've concluded the presentation and I'm open to questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was a lot of math.
It was a
Piece of
lot.
work. Well done.
Thank you.
Yep.
Comments or questions?
And there's a lot of information for us to digest right now. So.
I guess you present a very compelling case. And I guess one thing it would be practical to do, and certainly not disputing your numbers or anything, but we just simply have it vetted and take the comments that have been gathered through here, make the adjustments, and then I agree, disagree, talk about what direction we want to go.
Mhm.
We want to basically follow this methodology and model. And in the end, I guess it leads us to a much better place. But if it's a bigger task in many ways. Well,
Or we're done. We're done milestone 1, call it good. We can get to the work of, it's done. We could call it good. We could submit this to the people that administer the toolkit with the recommendation that this would have put us 2 years ahead if they had just auto-filled with these numbers. And it would just be better for their whole program to assume a scope 3 analysis based on federal numbers and then make adjustments as you see fit. But the idea that every municipality is supposed to start by reinventing the wheel with elaborate mathematical calculations, that nobody has that kind of experience that is being asked to do this. And it's happening on a staff level where they're not, we're incredibly fortunate that our town staff takes these issues seriously and they were willing to lean in and try to sort through the issues, but that can't be the expectation for every municipality. The system that as it is radically dysfunctional, and what we're doing here could be replicated everywhere. There's no reason it has to. I consider this much easier and much more accurate.
Well, What I can do is we will speak with PCP to explore what it would take if we're looking at an alternative method of assessing our emissions, and if that would be acceptable. And if so, then what would be the next steps? So essentially, if we are proposing to review our methodology for assessing greenhouse gas emissions, and if this one seems to be easier or more accurate or both, then maybe we can explore that option.
I mean, there's a bunch of examples of them, except I'm 100% positive that it is allowable to not use the toolkit for sure. What I would suggest though is we go a step further and we submit this to them, have them, like, I would love for them to, I may very well have made mathematical errors. I would love for anybody to weigh in with alternative things, but I think what we should suggest is that they vet this and the concept of moving to what I'm describing, not just for us, but for everyone, and have that be the feedback that we provide.
But I don't know if PCP would actually, they might recognize methodology for our individual plan. I don't know they would.
Scale it up.
Well, but also would they vet the inputs? Would they validate the inputs? Would they challenge the inputs, or like where would they collect data to? Because they don't have, they rely on our data, I guess.
It's a good question. I've had a good back and forth with them. They're very reasonable people. This conversation started with me trying to get their data of like where are they getting their inputs for these calculations, and none of it is based on direct measurements. It's a very similar system to this, and so I'm quite confident that they would find this system defensible. This is a very standardized, it wouldn't be the first time they've seen this exact method used. I imagine there would be a significant number of people on their team that would much prefer everybody use a scope 3. That's not, most people in this space don't love this system with scope 1s. It's not a helpful thing to have everybody systematically undercounting their footprint. So I think it would be well received, is what I'm saying. I think they might very well act on it. At the very least, we've contributed something meaningful to the process, and we made an effort to refine the system. And something good came out of 2 years of trying to chase down numbers that are questionable at best.
But I would agree. I think most Canadians, be some difference between urban and rural and different geographic regions, but our carbon footprint as an individual probably doesn't vary significantly. Now, the actions we take individually, whether it's heat pumps versus natural gas or electric vehicles versus gas or diesel, the improvements we make to our home to reduce our carbon footprint, all these things will impact individually, but on a mass scale, they're not that impactful yet.
Agreed. They kind of work out in the wash. Like, for instance, Toronto's footprint, the per household is at 34 tons per household, and the national average is 37. But that, our grid is a little greener, and that's an urban center, so that, that probably, but that discrepancy of a few tons per household is not nearly as big as the discrepancy between the number I got to in a scope 1 versus the number we got to in the scope 3. That's a much bigger error range.
Where I was, my questions go to, I like this staying in our lane. I'm not sure food security is within our lane to do what you're suggesting here, to mobilize 150 farms over. And
fair point. Basically the food security as an issue is something that most of the council ran on. If they weren't talking about climate change, they were talking about that. And I see it as the more as just a dad in Smiths Falls and looking down the road at a reality where there's going to be food shortages and famine. I'm scared to death of what is coming down the pipe with climate change, and I would like to see us leaning into any and every way that we can make sure there's always enough food for everyone here, and including stocking the waterway with fish, including planting fruit trees. I think we should put that into our lane, even though it doesn't naturally go there.
Making sure everybody has access to food, you're just trying, that's a goal. And I think that's what a lot of council was talking about. They weren't necessarily talking about food hubs like the kind that we ran for 10 years. We were like 15 years ahead of our time.
Yep.
We being a group of good people. Sean?
Yeah, I guess the one question regarding this, taking scope 3 and this methodology is, how do we keep score? How do we know how we are individually, how our community is reducing their carbon footprint?
So for that, if people down there, I think under the system, there's a reevaluation in 5 years. And for that, if we want to look at the data we collected now and the data we collect in 5 years and see, like, we're seeing a 20-point reduction or whatever, we can show that in our modeling. Like there's no commitment to only using a statistical extrapolation. And also the things that we're doing to reduce our carbon footprint are quantifiable. For instance, like if we're making biochar out of our green waste, if we're putting in a transit system, like all of those, we can try to account for where that differential lies and pull that out of it. But all of these numbers are imperfect, and I would say the scope 1, that issue is just as significant. It's not both of them that it's challenging to update the data.
Okay, we've had a lot to think about. I'd like to, it's 3:30. We've got to get to a couple more things. Can I bring this back July 9th for our next discussion? Because I think we need to
Yes, we can definitely
step
bring it back.
away. Well, thanks, Richard. I think we need to step away and finish up the agenda and let me.
For sure, yes.
Yeah. And come back to it, July 9th. Okay?
That works. We'll bring it back for discussion.
Yep, go ahead. So you've been very
I haven't said anything
quiet.
yet. So in the interests of getting on with things, I appreciate your work. I do. But we are up against it. We don't have a lot of time to be doing a lot of detail. So I would recommend, in fact, that we, in the town of Smith Falls, continue with the contract with PCP as is, that this be a second system, and that if the town and the committee want to put the resources into using this, developing it, it be second parallel system. And that you submit this to ICLEI and PCP and say, because other municipalities have come up with interesting things too that they have submitted to them, right, for consideration. Yes, there is a methodology there, and it's being implemented by, 500 municipalities in Canada right now. They need to have some consistency, right? And so I think for us to get on with things, we should just stay with what we have right now. I'm not saying throw this out, but I'm not saying adopt it as our only system either.
Would that not be faster though?
No.
The argument for urgency seems to me like, let's go with the completed one then.
Sorry. No. And I don't need to get into detail now, but at least exactly as Peter talked about, Smith Falls being a key proponent of a food hub here for 10 years, right? And I'm not talking about the new hub, but the older one, like that was part of the mission, right?
Yeah,
we all know this is a real challenge here. So, no, I don't think
However,
it will
I
be
want to
faster
talk
at all.
more about it. Also, when we say you do things, like you can only do things on behalf of the committee. So I think by July 9th, if we want to submit something, it comes from the committee and not from not stopping you from doing all your work. But I think it gives you heft if the committee says when we go to talk federally or even the council.
Well, it's got to be federally. It's got to be supported by council first.
Yeah.
So I'm intrigued. I want to talk to some folks and talk more. And July 9th, it's back on our agenda.
Okay.
Heat pump workshop
Yes.
2 days from now.
Yes. Come,
Thursday.
everybody. Hot water heating system. So these are hot water heat pumps. And there's an awful lot of excitement and interest in these. And part of it is because they do, generate heat at a third of the cost of standard hot water heating systems. They actually too can cool and reduce humidity in basements. So
Hmm.
we're also, talking about other hot water heating systems. So the on-demand systems, we'll mention solar, and we have, at least of last week anyway, we had something like 45 people signed up for the workshop. So please come and show your face.
Starting at 6.
I'll tell you here, 6:30 to 8:30.
Smith Falls Arena?
Yep.
Okay.
So, and please do, do what you can to spread the word. That would be great.
I know I have a public health board meeting that night.
Right.
I'm the chair of the board.
You sort of have to be
It
there.
might end like at 6:30 or something.
Oh.
And it's by Zoom.
Oh.
So I could be here and then just, anyways.
So, this whole series of workshops we've been holding around the county, different locations. So this is one in particular that we're holding in Smith Falls. So that's that. Now,
I don't know if folks have had a chance to look at the backyard chicken considerations there for public consultation. I really hope that we get a good response. I'm certainly hearing more pro backyard chicken.
Mm.
I haven't heard any negative. There was one letter come in just worrying about avian flu and transmission. Public health can comment on that.
Okay, we talked about the greenhouse gas issues around it, but one area that I think kind of bumps in between public health and climate change is our tick problem. And my main reason for wanting chickens in my yard is I want them running around eating all the ticks, same as quails. And the tick problem is very directly tied to climate change. And I think it's the most compelling reason to legalize chickens. And so I would like to include that in the climate explanation of why they should legalize chickens. That there's a concern there. And also when we're talking about the counter, if we didn't legalize chickens, people are still buying chickens from factory farmed areas. So in no way has that reduced the threat from avian flu. If anything, it's made it worse. And in a rural area where people are working on these farms, it's much better to have a few chickens in everyone's household than it is a giant farm full of chickens. To me, the public health argument is very clearly in favor of chickens, in addition to the biochar or to the climate change.
So at the very least, fill out comments. We'd love to hear them.
I haven't had a chance to look at this, apologize. So I haven't got a clue what impact it may or may not have on actual greenhouse gas emissions.
Less, it's on the spectrum. It's been brought up as a small piece in the presentation to council.
As
It's a diversion of compost,
a-
basically.
Something that, okay.
Okay, and there was taking action.
Yes. So I am concerned, and part of this came out of the last meeting, I think, that we talked about bringing something forward to council, Peter, right? Showing that we're moving forward. And I'm getting more and more concerned, quite frankly, about the next federal election and the responses of the provincial government. And I don't want to see us miss out on opportunities. And so there are two, I'm conscious of the fact that Smith Falls income is low. There are two low income programs right now that I think we should be doing a major push on in this town. Why not? Why can't we do something that gets a mail out to everybody? I don't know, but let's take advantage of those now, because they could well disappear in the next election. So, and there's no reason that town of Smith Falls people shouldn't be taking advantage of these.
Richard, did you throw your hand up?
I did, yeah. So are they two federal programs? Or are they just,
They're actually provincial, Save on
Provincial.
Energy.
okay.
What are these?
One is focused on people who heat with natural gas, And the other is focused on people who heat with electricity, which I appreciate is going to be very, minuscule in Smith Falls, but there still may be some because I know when I did the whole audit programming, all that stuff, there were people who just refused to have natural gas because of their concerns about safety. And in these, in the electricity one, you're eligible for a free low temperature heat pump, refrigerators, freezers, other electric appliances, all free, insulation and air sealing. And in the natural gas one, it's not quite as rich, but it's all free. So, and I know, because I see this on social media, lots of people are concerned when they see promotion about these programs on social media because they think it's a scam. And there's enough, organizations out there trying to promote things that are scams. So if we could get behind these.
Do you want us to promote it through our social media networks?
Not just social media. Let's think, let's think about how do we seriously get the bulk of the people in Smith Falls on these programs? Why not? Right?
So two factors, I guess. Like one, we probably have the opportunity to put inserts for their water bills.
Yeah.
There you go.
But and that's a pretty easy one. That's going to go to property owners. And for the town, we're not far off 50-50 homeowners.
Renters.
So
Interesting.
the one challenge we have is getting that half who are the landlords.
And I have to
wanting-
check, but I think the natural gas one is eligible, or that landlords are eligible.
So that's where we need some insight because,
Yeah.
I mean, I would think a lot of units are provided with the heat included, and so the landlord has the opportunity to save money. But so it's that communication strategy, how we can be most effective.
Yeah.
It's similar, council endorsed a plan for a private insurer who insures water breakage that's on your property or sewer backup.
Right.
And for like a few dollars, if something happens on your pipe, you're insured and covered.
Yes.
So the town actually vetted that, endorsed it, and then promoted it several ways. It's not dissimilar.
Right.
These are good programs, and we do it. The county has great programs around portable rent subsidies
Yes.
and
Yep.
improvements, and it's just another in the line of that.
Yep.
As long as we have the communication.
These are through IESO, it's a branch of government, so.
After we talked about it, I took a stab at modeling the impact of those programs, and I hit a wall that maybe is surmountable. But the issue is basically, you just reminded me of it. It's a significant amount of the population of Smith Falls is low income, but they're not necessarily homeowners. And so when you do a survey of the income and how many people fall below it, the data set that I didn't have is of the people that actually own the homes, because they would have to be low income in order to be eligible for the program. So that was why I wasn't able to get a number on what a total adoption would look like. But if we could get that number, I could do the math on it.
But I'm sorry, that's not reason to not do it.
Agreed.
Right?
Mhm.
Okay, so.
Yeah, I wasn't saying that.
So what is the action then? These two programs in particular, amplifying their availability to the residents of Smith Falls, and that the town do that through our communications team.
Yep.
That's a recommendation from this committee through staff to our communications team.
Yes.
And we have that information available, and it's probably in already a consumer-friendly format, right? It's
Yeah,
Can you send us the two specific programs? Okay, thanks.
and everybody agrees that we would request.
And why don't we just take it one step further and building on the theme of Electrify Lanark, would there be merit in hosting a workshop, or has Electrify Lanark hosted a workshop on these topics?
not in those programs in particular, but we certainly could look at doing that in the fall. We are planning to bring back our neighborhood climate concierge project in the fall. And so that would be a natural avenue to do that through.
Okay.
Yeah.
build upon it.
Okay, that's great, and the committee agreed to do that.
Well, and I think too, just to add, I mean, it looks like then publicly, it looks like we're doing something. Right?
Right.
Sorry, but
So it comes out from not the town, but from the committee of the
I
town.
think so.
Yeah.
Like,
Yes.
Yeah.
CAP project next steps.
Okay.
And then Joanne sent a great update here, but it can't wait till July.
Okay, so in terms of the next steps, I've updated the little timeline that I created here. I will zoom in on it since it's easier to see. So essentially, my hope is that if we finish milestone 1 by the end of July, we can get started on milestone 2 and 3. So to clarify, milestone 2 essentially is setting the target specifically, like the numbers that we're going to be reducing our emissions by. And then milestone 3 is in the menu of options. So we discussed before, so the menu of options will have to be done first before we set the targets, so we know exactly what targets we're going to be reducing, what actions are going to get us to the number that we're reducing it by. In speaking with Lanark County, they actually employed who was it?
Greenscape.
I think, is it Greenscale?
Yeah, Greenscape.
Greenscale, yes. So Greenscale, essentially, they did the math and they created a menu of options. It took them roughly 2 months. And so through that work, they were able to determine what number they're looking to reduce their emissions by. Now, if we're going to be going with the recommended number, I think it's IPCC, International Governmental Panel, essentially the number that they're going by, would be roughly a 7% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions per year for the next, say, number of years until we reach our target. So either we go with that recommendation and we essentially determine a number of menu items based on trying to meet the recommended reduction target by, or we set our own target number and we have a number of menu of options. So there's roughly 2 ways to look at it. Either we set it first or after. So that would be the next step once we finish milestone 1. And in conjunction, there would be a survey that goes out to get the public's interest in what they're looking to also participate in.
Did you need a decision today on that?
No, this is just letting you know what we're considering.
And in July, if we have the discussion on scope 3, because I think Sue has suggested, and I'm leaning that way, we keep going on this path, but is there a parallel path that we want to consider, which needs very fascinating presentation on scope 3, and I'm intrigued by that, and I'm looking forward to another discussion about how we can either run parallel without overburdening anybody, including volunteers on the committee. So that will be back on the agenda too as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And just for clarity, I see no problem with doing them in parallel, other than if the thing we're landing on and submitting is the more ambitious one, all of the work, it just feels like kind of a waste of staff resources where we could, to Sue's point, all of the work that's currently going into modeling could be directed towards actually trying to reduce the footprint.
Mm-hmm.
That's my only pushback to running them in parallel. Otherwise, I think it's better to do both, frankly, because we'll learn more. It's like
Right.
there's a lot of good behind it. It's just a question of being mindful of staff time.
Yeah, also the mandate that we have is to do the FCM process that they've outlined. And so if
They'll accept us for that, though.
yeah, well, that's what I'd like to,
Yeah,
that's part of the discussion, July.
For sure.
Me. Yeah. Great. This is about, Joanne sent a note on a project they're working on, the 3 public health units on climate change and health vulnerability adaptation assessment. It's very interesting. It'll be done by December, but it'd be better if she was here to talk
Explain.
about it. It's not time sensitive. It was for information. And I think I'll ask her to bring that July 9th and come back.
Okay, that takes us to our next question.
Oh,
Sorry, can I add something else?
well, we've got the RVCA
Completely.
wetland on there.
I completely forgot about this other thing though.
Okay,
It's
is
brief.
it short and sweet?
Yes. So this is the other thing. So just last week, the county held a planning session around an adaptation plan. And so we should know about that, and we should be connected with the county. And I'm sorry, I don't know if they invited you or not.
I'll have to double check. The county had a few things going.
I think that was the thing Noel was telling us about. We didn't end up going because you were gone for like most of that.
Oh yeah, so that was last week?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was unavailable.
Okay.
So
So was it staff only, or was it?
It was staff and Climate Network, Lanark, lower tiers was a mix. And so they ran us through 4 scenarios of climate crises and, what would we do? What resources would we need? That sort of thing. So it was sort of, and this is all because their intern is doing this adaptation plan for the county, right? So, and I can't remember the program through which the intern was assigned to Lanark County. It wasn't even a request. And so the intern is finishing, I think, in mid-July, and there will be some adaptation plan. So we should have that, right? Just as a reference tool. So
If those interesting opportunities come up, it'd be nice to share it with
Mhm.
somebody else. Could have made it if you couldn't have, Richard. Maybe. So I wasn't sure how it was invited, but that's great.
I guess the next time I'll just share with the committee and you guys will figure out if you have the time.
If it's appropriate, some things are better.
Should we have a
Sure.
presentation here? Or wait till the result?
you actually, absolutely can ask. I'll never get his name right. Lalit, I think is his name. The intern who's working for the county. He could come and present
Yeah,
on it
I mean,
for sure.
what was appropriate there would be appropriate here for strategy,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, for sure. So our meeting is July 9th,
Ninth.
right? So yeah, if he leaves mid-July, then that would probably fit.
Okay.
Have you met this person, Richard?
No, I only know Noelle, so I'll speak with her and get more information.
She's just Tay Valley. So it's Michelle or
Michelle from the Lanark?
Yeah.
Okay.
Atlantic County.
Right.
So yeah.
Okay. Speak with
Ask
Michelle then.
if they would be available for a 15-minute presentation and then conversation after on July 9th.
Okay.
And I know that Rideau Valley Conservation Authority is having a consultation on their wetland plan Thursday night in Perth, in Drummond North, actually, at the Civitan
Yes.
on Highway 43 from 6 to 8, I think. It's a couple hours. And I think it's a pop in, do the consult,
Yes.
leave, come as you are, which would be interesting to talk to them about wetland. And I've reviewed that full report, the draft. It was put out either through you or through council.
It came through or received to carry.
Well, I'm also on their mailing list, so.
So
Sorry,
a
Peter, what did you
question.
Pardon?
The date for that again, sorry?
20th. June 20th,
Yes,
Thank you.
6 to 8.
Same night as
Civitan
another
I
Friday
know.
Lanark.
I know. Like,
in Perth.
Yep. The comments, though, close sometime in July. And so it's a question, and I would advocate from CNL's position that it would be wonderful if Smith Falls could submit comments on the RBCA's wetlands inclusions.
And I wonder if our manager of development services maybe has that on his radar.
I'll talk to him and see what
Okay.
is on his radar.
It's ironic that you suggested this 3 years ago, that the county talked to RBCA board about incorporating MVCA's wetlands policies. And now the province has brought them in a fashion. In a fashion.
Ahead of your time.
So anyway, I do think it would be worthwhile for the town of Smith Falls to submit some
Okay.
comment.
I'll bring it up with Carl and we'll discuss
Given our significant
wetlands here.
wetland.
Yeah.
And Lower Reach Park, as you pointed out earlier. I'm not seeing anything else on our agenda.
There's one thing.
Okay, there is one thing.
One last thing. So we mentioned that so the meeting time will have to change for the next meeting, so it will not be July 9th.
Okay,
We're proposing the next Tuesday, So not the 9th, but I don't know what the next Tuesday would be.
16th.
16th. Yeah, so if you guys are available to be here on July 16th at the same time, then I would love to see that. If not, we'll figure out something.
Is it possible to send out a meeting notice that goes into your calendar?
Yes,
An invite?
yes, there is. There's one that we can send out a general one for all the members to be reoccurring. But typically how it is we assess and we determine the meeting time every single time. But we can have a standing appointment and we'll change it if it needs to be.
It's nice to have the invite. I agree. I missed
like
one
that?
last week because I didn't, there's no excuse for me missing it, but I missed one. It was in my calendar.
Yep.
It's better.
Okay, so I'll create an enrolling invite so that it will be reminders for everyone.
And we're going to try for the 16th.
Yes.
It's in my calendar now, so it has to be 16th.
It's in mine too, and I've taken that out on the 9th. So if you could send a notice
I will.
soon
Yeah.
to the people that aren't here, Peter and Joanne.
Yep.
All right, motion to adjourn.
Sorry.
Oh.
Did Steve have?
Sorry, Steve.
Did you have something, Steve?
I hope you can make it on the 16th.
No. Yeah, I'll try to make it.
All right. Motion to adjourn, moved by Nate, seconded by Sue. All in favor, carried. Thank you.
Okay.